Coming up on Locked On Dodgers, we talk about Clayton Kershaw and his future and why it needs to happen a little bit quicker than it did last year. We'll talk about the Dodgers and their demeanor and their attitude, and do they need that to change? And then we'll also talk about the types of players the Dodgers go after. Does that need to change? Looking at changes and looking at Clayton Kershaw, that's what's on tap. So make sure to keep it Locked On Dodgers.
You are Locked On Dodgers, your daily Los Angeles Dodgers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yo, Dodger fans. Welcome to Locked On Dodgers. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, the #1 local sports daily podcast network. Locked On, your team every day. This is the daily podcast covering the Los Angeles Dodgers, bringing you the smart fans' perspective on our boys in blue. This is a podcast that you can find wherever you find podcasts and on YouTube simply by searching for Locked On Dodgers. And if you want to subscribe and make it easy on yourself, that's the best way to go about it, because you'll never miss a day, because you know we're not going to. This is your first time listening or watching. I'm Vince Samperio, and that's my co-host, Jeff Snider. We're usually here together, sometimes not, but today we are here together. We're both lifelong Dodger fans that have spent time covering the Dodgers and currently cover the Dodgers in a few ways. We've spent time in the locker room, we've spent time in spring training, we've spent time in different areas around the Dodgers, but we're not quite insiders. We're just here bringing you the smart fans' perspective on our boys in blue, and that's what we're here to do today, or at least as smart as we can get on this here podcast, talking about the Dodgers. But first, before we get into what we have today, we're going to talk about Clayton Kershaw. We're going to talk about a couple of things of the Dodgers' philosophy. Should it change? How should it change? Do they need different types of personalities or different types of players? But real quick, Jeff talked about some things on yesterday's episode, and he wants to add to that real quick.
Yeah, although first, the thing I'm thinking about right now is I'm looking at our hats, and I know they're the same color because they're both Dodger hats, and yet they look different because of the different lighting. And now I'm wondering if our shirts are also the same color, even though they don't look like it. Is your shirt navy blue?
Yeah.
Yeah, mine too. Interesting. All right. So that's lighting talk with Jeff and Vince today. But yesterday I talked about whether or not Dave Roberts makes the in-game decisions as the manager. Rich Eisen, who is a football commentator, said that the reason Dave Roberts isn't going to get fired is because he's just a puppet. He's just doing what the front office tells him to do. He's not making any decisions. And I talked about basically what a stupid idea that is. Andrew Friedman in his press conference the other day was asked about that, and he got pretty snippy. He said 100% he does, and we've answered this a lot of times. If it ever changes, I'll let you know. Seemed pretty annoyed by the question. Said, is this really still a narrative? And Bill Plaschke asked Dave Roberts about it on Wednesday, and Roberts said, everything that we do, there's information. I welcome all of it. There's so many scenarios I need to be prepared for, but ultimately, do I make the decisions? Absolutely. So we now have Andrew Friedman and Dave Roberts both saying that Dave Roberts makes the decisions. We have common sense telling us Dave Roberts makes the decisions, and yet people will still say Dave Roberts doesn't make the decisions. And I just want to throw one more thing out. Joe Maddon worked for Andrew Friedman for 9 years as manager. Joe Maddon is currently out of a job because he couldn't handle a general manager telling him to take his injured star player out of a blowout game. Do you really think Joe Maddon would have survived 9 years with the general manager telling him every move to make from the dugout? It just doesn't pass the sniff test. So anyway, now that everybody agrees with what I said yesterday, I hope that all of you do too.
Yeah, like I said, there's obviously there's info and data, and they go over stuff ahead of time, but some of the decisions that we have issues with that Dave Roberts makes are not based on analytics, and that's why the biggest reason you could tell why sometimes it doesn't work out is because of that reason right there.
Yeah, like I said yesterday, he could stand to listen to the nerds a little bit more sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so moving along, Clayton Kershaw is free agent. You talked a little bit yesterday about how, the Dodgers hope he comes back, and, they kind of want to allow him the time to figure it out. Kershaw said after the season that he wants to come back, but that some time at home could change that. But, the Dodgers have a big offseason ahead of them. They don't currently have, a bona fide ace. Julio's right there. But it remains to be seen if he's a number one on a really good team or a number two on a really good team type of deal. Anyways, the Dodgers have a big offseason. Clayton Kershaw is going to be part of that, but it's also a matter of, do the Dodgers force his hand a little bit and, try to say, hey, we need to know, give him a date. I don't think he's eligible for qualifying offers, but I'm not
He
entirely
is.
sure. Oh, he is,
He
because he
is
didn't.
because they
Yeah, because
didn't
they
give him
didn't
one
offer it.
last
Because they
year.
didn't offer it last year. So, yeah, Jeff, what do the Dodgers do? Do they kind of push his hand with the qualifying offer? Do they kind of let him sit, or do they just go about the regular way and kind of save a spot in case he comes back?
Yeah, I don't think they would do the qualifying offer unless he communicated to them that his options, that he's down to two options: retirement or coming back to the Dodgers. I don't think they're going to limit his ability to go to the Rangers if that's what he wants to do. So if that's really on the table, I don't think they'll give him a qualifying offer. I do think Andrew Friedman is going to have to find some way to gently communicate to him their timeline, because like you said, they've got Julio, they've got Gonsolin, they've got May. All three of the, Julio, there's not really question marks other than, is he going to be their number one pitcher? But you can count on Julio at this point. Dustin May, is he going to return to form? Tony Gonsolin, is the late season injury going to linger? And then they've got, Tyler Anderson. Do they try to bring him back? Andrew Heaney, do they try to bring him back? Then you've got the young guys, the guys who've already pitched some: Andre Jackson, Ryan Pepio, Michael Grove. And then you've got two prospects who both ended in AAA this year, Bobby Miller and Gavin Stone, who are probably their top two pitching prospects at this point. And they both finished in AAA. So both of them are going to be ready for the majors at some point. And so they've got a lot of starting rotation questions to answer. And, they've said they want Clayton Kershaw back. They definitely want Kershaw back. But last year, there was the lockout that gave him an extra 4 months or whatever it was, 3 months to figure things out, to recover from his elbow injury, all those things. And they're not going to have that luxury this year. And so I do think Kershaw is going to have to make his decision a lot earlier this offseason. And I think he can, because he's not coming off a career-threatening injury. He did, unfortunately, get bounced from the playoffs a little bit early. So he's going to have 3 weeks of that full-time dad stuff under his belt before he's even technically a free agent, And so I think he may be ready to make that decision a little bit quicker. But that's if he decides to come back. If he decides to retire, I think that decision might not come till, he's not going to pull the trigger on retirement until he's 100% sure. And he might not be able to be 100% sure of that in September. And so it's going to be tricky, but I do think they're going to have to figure out some way to pressure him without pressuring him, because their off-season plans on the free agent market and the trade market are going to depend in part on what Clayton Kershaw does.
Yeah, and I think for Kershaw, it's a matter of, he knows what it would mean for him to not have to, do the daily grind of being on a major league team. He knows what it is. They're up to 4 kids now. They got, they're all growing up in different stages of life right now, but it's a matter of, it would be hard for me to see him give it up after the season he had. He was still effective, still really good. And with just that taste in your mouth of, we didn't, do what I wanted to do. Yes, he does have the one World Series. Yes, the validation. He's talked about it before, how, it feels a little bit different. We've seen him act different. We've seen him do everything. But I just think that, no matter how long, obviously being at home with your kids and everything else, you're going to be like, oh man, this is great. This is good. But I think he's still going to come back. And I think he will know sooner rather than later. And I think it's one of those where he kind of has to make that decision sooner rather than later, because if he lets it sit and mingle, he's going to be stuck in a weird place where he does want both things. And then, it might put him, if he does want to come back, it might put him at a disadvantage, because he might not have been doing what he would needed to do in order to prepare for a regular season.
Yeah. And he's smart enough to know that, he wants to play for another World Series champion, and the Dodgers' best chance to win a World Series is for them to know what he's going to do as early as possible. So,
yeah. All right. We're going to get into some organizational things, some changes that the Dodgers, do they need to make? Should they make? Types of, when it comes to personalities, players, stuff like that. But first, let's talk about Rhone. Dress shirts are tricky. It's hard to find one that fits right. And I don't know, they're just always uncomfortable, or if they are comfortable, they're ugly, and whatever the case is. But you want something that's comfortable. You want something that matches your style, plus something that can handle, being out all day if you do have kids. And You like Clayton Kershaw and you want to spend all day with your kids, but you have like two different birthday parties and maybe baseball practice or whatever the case is, they got you covered. Rhone's got you covered. The dress shirt was due for a radical reinvention, and Rhone stepped up to the challenge because their commuter shirt is the most comfortable, breathable, and flexible shirt known to man. And here's why. Mobility is everything. They got four-way stretch fabric that provides breathability and flexibility. Looking good is easy because it's time to feel confident with a wrinkle-free shirt without the hassle. You don't have to worry about wrinkles. Rhone's wrinkle release technology is there to help you out as long as you keep wearing the shirt and stretch it out. And you're not going to smell horribly because they have Gold Fusion anti-odor technology that'll keep you smelling fresh and clean all day long as long as you keep that shirt on. And it's 100% machine washable, so it makes it easy. You don't have to go to the dry cleaner. So the commuter shirt can get you through any workday and straight into whatever comes next. So head to Rhone.com/locked on and use the promo code locked on to save 20% off your entire order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to RHONE.com/locked on and use code locked on. That's Rhone.com/locked on, code locked on. All right, Jeff. So you talked about Andrew Friedman's comments yesterday, and I kind of think one of the biggest comments that came out of it, or the biggest headlines, was the word organizational failure, which is what Andrew Friedman referred to as why the season ended earlier than they wanted to. And there's a lot of different ways to go about and think about what organizational failure can mean and everything else. They asked about trade deadline and pitching and all that kind of stuff, but the some of the things we've been seeing on social media, and we've also got a couple people that reached out to us in different capacities. One of the things that comes up is, and you touched on a little bit yesterday, is the Dodgers demeanor, or the way they are. And when they're winning, it's a business like demeanor, and all is good, and when they're losing, it looks like they don't care. And that's kind of the some of the wording we got, that the Dodgers don't care as much, or whatever the case is. And I even saw some calls on social media for us saying the players need to apologize on social media in order, to kind of rectify it. And it's one of those where the Dodgers have always had characters here and there, Puig, Kike, this year Hanser Alberto, but they've always kind of been a more calm and quiet team. They had the bubble machine that one year, but even then it wasn't anything over the top. They've had, the bananas, they've had other things, but they've never really had to bring that energy and use that, in order to give them an advantage. And we've seen them lose now in a couple years to a couple teams that did have that, the Braves and the Padres. Now, that's not the reason they won, but, it's a matter of they did look like they were having more fun, and maybe they were having more fun because they were winning, and that's probably what it is. But it's a matter of, do the Dodgers, is that one of the organizational failures? Is that something that they need to change? Is that a philosophy they should consider about changing? Or is it just a matter of winning solves it all? And you look like you're having more fun when you're winning in general.
I think that's the case. The Dodgers, they had a lot of fun this year. I mean, Hanser Alberto gets a lot of credit for that. The Dodgers, they seem to genuinely enjoy playing together. They had, the Wolf of Wall Street thing that even almost ended up in a bench clearing brawl with the Giants at one point. I mean, they were a fun team. And I think the reason they didn't look like they were having fun in the NLDS is because they weren't having fun in the NLDS because they were losing. They were, I think the sour faces were because of the 0 for 20 with runners in scoring position, not the cause of the 0 for 20 with runners in scoring position. I'm not opposed to bringing in more fiery personalities. I've seen some people saying, "Oh, they just got to go get Carlos Correa to replace Trey Turner, get a villain in the clubhouse." They had a villain in the clubhouse. His name was Trevor Bauer. People didn't care much for him. I don't know if you remember. It's not just that. It's I think that the reasons the Dodgers failed in the NLDS have absolutely zero to do with personality and zero to do with having enough fire. The Dodgers' first two runs on Saturday were scored on a business-like two-run double by Freddie Freeman. And their third run was scored on a business-like sac fly by Will Smith. Do you think Will Smith would hit a three-run double instead of a sac fly if he was a more fiery personality? I don't think his personality had anything to do with it. He got a pitch. He hit it hard. He hit it right at the left fielder. I don't understand how personality comes into play here.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe not rational, but it's also something that like I said, we've seen it happen now. We've seen it, and I guess it just depends because you look at the Phillies and the Padres right now, and the Phillies aren't like anything too crazy. They don't get too hyped. They got pretty. I wouldn't say business like, but they're not out there overly hyped. The Padres do have that hype, but they've toned it down in recent years as well after kind of being humbled a bit, and we'll see how they act now. And then you got the Yankees and Astros, who similarly they are happy when they're happy, but nothing too out of the box. So yeah, I don't think it's a rational thought, but I do think that I don't know. This is where we're rational, or I'm rational, 162 games. But then once it comes to October, I'm kind of like I am during football season, irrational and based off emotion and first thing that comes to mind and everything else. And it did feel a little bit different this year. It did feel, obviously they weren't scoring, and that's what was part of it. But it didn't feel like there was an edge, and not that they need to have an edge or they need to have someone that brings you an edge, but I don't know. It just would seem like you would feel better. I guess that's the main thing that this comes down to, is that you as a fan would maybe feel better if this team was like, oh yeah, like pumped up and emotion and everything else. And okay, like, when you get down, you still keep the energy up. And, that's something that I used to want my little league team to do when I coach little league, just because, that they're kids. And I think it's a big difference for kids showing emotion and being into a game and everything else than it is for, grown men that are getting paid, a lot of money to play baseball. But I think it just comes down to a little bit of rational, but also a little bit. I do think the Dodgers could use a little edge. I do think that the team has a lot of similar personalities in terms of when they're on the field, and I wouldn't mind seeing, someone or something to happen that livens it up just a little bit more than maybe Hanser Alberto.
Yeah, and I like I said, I'm not opposed to that. It's yeah, I just feel like, and maybe it is too much of the same personality. But we talked all year about what a great thing it is, the impact that Freddie Freeman had on Mookie Betts. Betts saw how hard Freddie works and took some of those things. Gavin Lux learned a bunch from Freddie Freeman, and I feel like there's more value there. And that doesn't mean you can't also learn something from a more fiery personality. I would love to have Bryce Harper on the team. Bryce Harper is never going to be accused of being mellow or calm, and I would love to have Bryce Harper on the team. But he's not available. And, the fact is, probably the one acquisition the Dodgers could make that would be the biggest this offseason would be Shohei Ohtani. Shohei Ohtani is nobody's idea of a firecracker. He's smiling and having fun and kind of having a business-like approach to dominating a baseball game. And I would love to have Shohei Ohtani. Jacob deGrom's not fiery. Noah Syndergaard was the fiery one, and he's the one who's not good anymore. Jacob deGrom is still very good and has no personality. It's like, I've just always, one of the things that made me laugh, Bill Plaschke's article today talked about how the Dodgers need more fire. And he was all about these personal attacks, saying that Mookie Betts is a $365 million player and he needs to start acting like it. Like it's a personal moral failing that Mookie struggled in the NLDS. Like, come on, Bill. But he also said that when the Dodgers signed Kirk Gibson in 1988, Fred Clare brought Kirk Gibson in just to provide that attitude. Kirk Gibson won the MVP in 1988. Kirk Gibson was a great baseball player. When the Dodgers signed him, the only thing Fred Clare said about Kirk Gibson was praising his speed and his power. Nothing about his attitude. Tommy Lasorda liked the attitude, but Fred Clare brought Kirk Gibson in because he was a heck of a ball player. And he showed that by winning the MVP and helping the Dodgers win a World Series. Guess what? Kirk Gibson's play on the field had a lot more to do with the 1988 World Series than Kirk Gibson getting mad at Jesse Orosco for putting eye black in his baseball hat. Like, no, Kirk Gibson was a good baseball player, and that's why the Dodgers signed him. Freddie Freeman is a great baseball player. That's why the Dodgers signed him. And Freddie Freeman was a great baseball player in 2021 when he helped the Braves win the World Series. Mookie Betts was a great baseball player in 2018 and 2020 when he helped the Red Sox and the Dodgers win the World Series. Had nothing to do with personality. And, I guess maybe there's a case to be made that you need one guy. And if I don't know who it would have been for the Braves last year, because Ronald Acuna was hurt, but maybe they had you think about that Braves team that won last year. It's like Jock Peterson wore pearls. That was about as edgy as they got. Jock Peterson dressed up like
They
one
had
of the
the
Golden
swords
Girls.
and they had the outlandish celebrations, and they had a lot of different little things. It wasn't the reason they won, but It did look a lot more fun on there, and even when the Dodgers were scoring runs, it didn't look like that.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I just think Austin Riley's boring. Freddie Freeman's boring. Dansby Swanson's boring. Like, I don't know. And maybe they did have more personnel than I'm remembering. All I remember is Jock Peterson dressing up like one of the Golden Girls and thinking that was cool. But yeah, I mean, I want the Dodgers to have as good of players as possible. And if they happen to have personality, great.
Yeah, I would like to. I wouldn't say they could prioritize it, but I do think that, and I do think that they could benefit from having a little bit different personality, which kind of lends itself into the next thing we're going to talk about a little bit. But before we get into that, just a quick reminder to make Locked On Dodgers your first listen of the day every day, and check us out wherever you get podcasts and on YouTube. All right, so the other part of this is, organizational decisions and everything else, and it kind of comes down to the trade deadline philosophy and maybe the team building philosophy as a whole. And it's about, the players around the margins. And in 2017, 2018, Chris Taylor wasn't expected to be a starter. He was, kind of a guy coming off the bench, but he did start. Kike Hernandez, same thing. Guys that would start on most teams, and Kike has been a starter when he's been healthy for the Red Sox. Jock Peterson, not so much, but guys that are good enough to be starters on like at least bad teams or mediocre teams. And then last year was kind of based more on injuries than anything else, but also they didn't have the depth. This year, the depth kind of reared its ugly head toward the end when nobody was really hitting, and it's a matter of do the Dodgers need to go after maybe a little bit more talent and kind of guys that maybe are going to sacrifice playing time in order to raise the bar of the bench and everything else. And you look at last year with the Braves and Eddie Rosario, Jock Peterson, Duvall. Those are the three guys they traded for at the deadline. Realistically, other than Peterson, you maybe don't expect too much from Duvall and Rosario, especially since they weren't. Duvall's doing a little better. Rosario's not doing good when they traded for him. They traded him for Pablo Sandoval, and those guys all ended up working out. But those guys were all starters on bad teams. And then over here with the Braves, they, moved around. They also got Jorge Soler. They also moved around. And, with the Dodgers this year, they did that with Joey Gallo. Didn't quite work out, but he wasn't even going to be a starter with the Yankees anymore. And yeah, he could have been a starter on like a Bad Rangers team, which is, kind of the point of this. But, those types of players, something that they kind of could go after. And, we see guys emerge every year as a random guy kind of going off and being a guy. Trent Grisham's not a random guy, but he's a guy that's gone off this year and in the postseason. There's been other guys. Last year the Braves had one pretty much every series, but I don't know. It just feels like they've kind of gone away and kind of settled with depth the last few years. And maybe I don't think that's what ultimately hurt them, but I do think it could be a little bit of a change or a shift in philosophy.
So you're saying, just to make sure I'm clear, you're saying focus for their bench players on guys who maybe would be starters on worse teams who can fill kind of that role, so they're basically more prepared to step in and start when they need to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mind that philosophy. For me, the challenge is figuring out who those guys are. I think maybe that's kind of what they thought they were getting with Hanser Alberto this year. Hanser Alberto batted 300 just a couple of years ago for the Orioles, and he was supposed to be a lefty masher. I think he was supposed to be the right-handed version of Jock Peterson in a way. Not as much power, but that kind of guy who he's only going to play against lefties, but he's going to play really well against lefties. And as it turned out, he played really poorly against everybody, and and the problem with that, it's kind of like building a bullpen. All you have is past performance to go by. And if you go by that, you end up signing a guy like Eddie Rosario, which the Braves did. They re-signed Eddie Rosario after his 2021 postseason. And Eddie Rosario batted 212 with a 64 OPS plus this year and had a postseason OPS of .000, which is about as bad as you can get. I feel like that's one of those things that is the definition of easier said than done. Like, it's just, how do you find those guys? How do you know who those guys are and what you're, how, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to find those guys. And maybe, I don't know if you have ideas on that, but for me, it just seems like it's one of those things that's a lot easier to say than to actually do.
Yeah, and it is obviously, I think it's kind of different. Trace Thompson's an example of they got him because they needed him at the time. He ended up being pretty serviceable, pretty good, and being that guy. But then when it came down to it, he's been out of the league for a couple years, or in and out of the league last couple years. And in the postseason, it kind of looked like he was a guy that had been out of the league for a couple years. So it kind of goes, I don't know. It, like I said, it's not an easy thing, and it's not going to be one way that they can just figure this out all of a sudden. But you think about guys that they maybe haven't gone after before, and maybe this is something the DH might help with as well. But a guy like Kyle Schwarber, who the Dodgers didn't really, they maybe showed interest, but not enough interest that got anything buzzing or anything else like that. But a guy that not that great on defense, can hit, and can carry your offense at times. And he's a guy that went pretty cheap last year. That could be one type of guy they kind of go after. And they kind of had that in, AJ Pollock, but AJ Pollock kind of became that guy after they signed him. They didn't sign him to kind of be that type of guy. But then, you look, there's different ways. You look at the flip side. The Phillies also paid Nick Castellanos, and he was really bad this year. And he's a guy that you maybe would have thought was in, that similar type of mold. But also he came up with a couple clutch hits in the postseason. And, not that Nick Castellanos and, Trace Thompson are similar players. They're obviously way different players in terms of who they were. But, I think I don't know. It's kind of, you throw it. It's weird because they can have like two rotating spots where you just try to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall, see what hits. And then even then it's not going to work out. But I do think it's interesting, especially with the comments that Friedman made about young players coming up and that kind of stuff. And it's also like, with the team that's built for making the postseason and to be a World Series contender, do you want to head into your season with young, unproven players and then have to trade for players and maybe overpay a little bit at the deadline when you can maybe come in with those players if they're cheap enough and then cut bait if you need to, or look at some of the younger guys? It's going to be a hard balance, but I do think could shift a little bit, and I don't know which way to shift, but I do think they could look around the bench and like players a little bit more like they did. I feel like they got lucky in the past, but they can kind of build that back up.
Yeah, maybe. I do think it's going to be fascinating to see how they approach this offseason because, it's like, okay, Miguel Vargas, are we going to give him a starting job? James Outman, is he going to be on our roster or are we going to use him as trade bait? And the Dodgers in the past, with Corey Seager, they said, okay, Corey, you're going to come up, you're going to be our shortstop. Jock Peterson, you're going to come up, you're going to be our center fielder. And they went with that. But those Dodgers teams didn't have quite the expectations that these ones do. And so, it's kind of the downside of World Series or bust, because even those first four years at least of this 10-year stretch, we were happy to make the postseason. It's like, okay, let's win the division. And then if we can get hot, great, but there wasn't that expectation. And now having been to the World Series 3 times, having, it had a couple other times when they definitely should have gone to the World Series and didn't, the expectations are higher. And so it's going to be a lot harder to get a Bobby Miller into the starting rotation. It's definitely harder to get Bobby Miller and Gavin Stone into the rotation at the same time, when your goal is to win the World Series. And, the Padres apparently are going to be here for a while. And so they're probably going to be back to being big competition in the National League West next year. Luckily the Padres don't have a farm system anymore. So who knows how much competition there'll be in the actual long 162 game season next year. But like this year, the Dodgers could have afforded to go with Bobby Miller and Gavin Stone in the rotation because they were going to win the division basically from day one. Next year, who knows what that's going to be, but it's going to be an interesting approach because I think you've got to get some of these rookies some playing time or trade them, and trading them makes for a lot more expensive roster. You have to have those young underpaid guys in order to have a manageable roster where you can afford to pay Mookie Betts and Freddie Freeman and whoever ends up playing shortstop for the Dodgers next year. You've got to have those rookies, those young guys offsetting that salary, or you're just going to end up, spending like the Golden State Warriors. And it's that was a basketball reference. I know, I'm kind of a basketball expert here. Is it real? I really saw like their payroll this year is like $480 million or something.
Oh, yeah,
The
like
Warriors,
after luxury taxes, yeah.
So, that's ridiculous. But yeah, I don't know what the Dodgers approach is going to be, because they are going to have to find that balance. And, when it comes to these bench players, I mean, they might just have to roll with Edwin Rios and other guys like that. Unless they, Brandon Drury is going to be a free agent. I really like the idea of Brandon Drury on the Dodgers. There's guys like that, but Brandon Drury had a really good year. He's probably going to get paid more than they're looking to pay a bench player, and he's probably going to be looking for more of a role than a bench player. So it's hard to find those guys who are willing to take a bench role and good enough to fill that role you're talking about.
Yeah, and then also on the flip side for the pitching, kind of what you mentioned is kind of where the other part of it is we've seen some guys sign recently for not that much money. They're good pitchers that maybe didn't sign for that. Carlos Rodon, the Dodgers could have easily offered him that deal and been okay. Even Kevin Gausman, they could have easily offered him the same deal he got. And they would have been all right. And then Luis Castillo, he signed an extension with the Mariners. It wasn't that much money either, and it's one of those things where the Dodgers had Walker Buehler and Julio, and like that makes sense, but also were they holding out for a Tony Gonsolin, which Tony Gonsolin ended up being really good this year and ended up starting the All-Star game and everything else. But now when you look back at it, or when you look forward at it, is like, would you rather have a guy like Luis Castillo for the next 5 years, or would you rather have a guy like Tony Gonsolin? Now, obviously, like Castillo is going to cost you prospects, and that's a different type of thing. But it's also, I do think that they could get in the starting pitching market in a different way. Tyler Anderson worked out; that was a cheap deal. But it's also some of these guys that maybe aren't aces, but they can be an ace in a one-game situation type of thing, that are making like 20-25 mil, where they might be able to take a risk or take a chance. I don't think there's really any guys like that this year. It's a pretty weak overall pitching free agency.
There's actually Carlos Rodon again.
Well,
he's going to opt out of his contract. I'm 1,000% in favor of signing Carlos Rodon.
Yeah, so it's things like that I think they, they're trying to find that balance, and obviously it's not easy. But I do think there's different ways they can kind of see, okay, this worked, but it didn't always work, and this could work. It's a balancing act, and as we talk about it, you see how hard it is for these general managers and Friedman and all these guys to figure things out. And we can be fans and think it's easy and go get this guy, but at the end of the day, you don't really ever know what's going to happen.
Yeah, the only 3 pitchers on the market this offseason, potentially who would be worth really going after with a lot of money, it's actually 3 guys who they all could stay with their current teams. Carlos Rodon and Jacob deGrom both have opt-outs with their teams, and Justin Verlander has a player option with the Astros. And those are the 3 guys who could really come in and be, maybe 1A and 1B with Julio or whatever.
So that was, I guess, a good conversation. That's kind of the stuff people have mentioned, and we can kind of have different opinions a little bit, and that's a good thing for us. So we'll see what we get into tomorrow. We're kind of past the NODS at this point. We're kind of moving forward. We're gonna have a lot of stuff for there's a lot to get into. Should the Dodgers go after Ohtani? Should the Dodgers go after so-and-so? Should the Dodgers go after Correa? There's a bunch of different shortstops. So there's a lot coming for you guys for, unfortunately, an early off season that, we'll try to, we'll fill that time for sure talking Dodgers. Jeff, you got anything else before we head out?
No, but we might need to talk soon about Justin Turner, because I feel like their decision on Justin Turner actually has a pretty big bearing on the stuff we talked about today as far as their bench, because Justin Turner is more and more a DH every day. And if they do bring him back, that kind of limits their options in some other ways. So I think tomorrow we'll probably need to talk about, should the Dodgers exercise Justin Turner's $16 million team option?
Yeah, that's a good one to get into. So that's what we'll get into tomorrow, as long as anything else that comes up. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen. Make sure to check out Locked On MLB for your second listen. Our pal Sully is over there covering baseball. He's got the #1 daily league-wide podcast that's available on Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts, which is also where you can find us if you search for Locked On Dodgers. You can also find us by searching for Locked On Dodgers on Twitter and Instagram. You can find Jeff on Twitter at Snider. I'm at Vince Samperio. DMs are open on all those accounts if you need to get a hold of us, questions, comments, concerns. Like I said, we got 3 extra weeks of off season that we thought we were going to have. So, any questions or comments or thoughts you guys have that you want to hear about, go ahead and let us know. You can let us know on social. You can let us know via email, lockedondodgers@gmail.com. or you can let us know via voicemail text at 323-863-5625. We're here every weekday morning, and we hope you'll be with us when you get in your car or if you're at home to our Smart Device Play podcast, Locked On Dodgers. And remember, you don't have to agree, you just have to listen. Have a good one.
We'll talk to you tomorrow.